Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's my privilege to welcome back a repeat guest, Dr. Joel Pérez of Apoyo Coaching. Joel is a friend of mine. He's a fellow coach. He has an ICF accreditation. He also does training. He's a strength-trained coach for the Gallup Strength Finder, and he's also an expert on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today, we're going to talk about how to move from cultural competency to cultural humility. Joel's going to talk about a new course that he's developed. And if you're interested in that resource, you can check the show notes. And he's offering to Deep Dive listeners now until the end of September of 2022 a 50% off discount off of his course. You can use the coupon code DEEPDIVE50. Again, that's all in the notes. And before we move into the interview, let me also remind listeners, if you're interested in centering prayer and you'd like to join me and my fellow centering prayer author Rich Lewis for a monthly centering prayer gathering in which we do a little teaching, do Q&A, and also have a 20-minute centering prayer session together. You can sign up for that at www.centeringprayerbook.com, or you can email me directly and express your interest at deepdivespirituality@gmail.com. Our next one will be August 27th, 2022, but if you sign up, you'll get updates for the monthly gatherings that we'll be doing for the foreseeable future. Let's jump into the conversation with Joel. Hey, Joel, welcome back to the Deep Dive podcast. It's so great to have you on again.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Yeah, we're going to talk about moving from cultural competence to cultural humility a little bit today. And I know you have some exciting projects that you've been working on that you want to share, but just kind of let's jump in easy. And what's kind of the growing edge in your own work as a cultural competency and cultural humility coach? What are some insights that you've gotten recently from, again, the kind of the challenging times that we've found ourselves in?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Again, thanks for having me. I think what I'm encountering as I work with clients around this idea of developing cultural humility, moving from cultural competence to cultural humility, is that people really like the term or the concept of cultural humility. They've never really thought about it in that way. Meaning they tended to think about doing or engaging in work around diversity, equity, and inclusion from a competency standpoint, in that they attend a conference or a workshop or read a book, and they feel at times they've thought, okay, I think I get this stuff. But then they realize in doing the work that, wait, I really don't get this stuff. And so meaning they hit a snag or they hit a challenge in trying to be more inclusive or developing a more inclusive organization. And so cultural humility gives them another way to think about it, because the idea with cultural humility is that there's really no end in that. It's not something to be achieved. It's more of having the right posture in the work that we're doing, because the right posture will get you more results than if you are trying to achieve something where you're checking a box or where you feel like, okay, I've achieved something. I think I got it. And in doing the work, you realize, no, I don't got it. I thought I knew this thing, but I don't know this thing. So how do I do this work? As cultural humility is a way to think about it, to give people or to have people think about what it means to have the right posture to get better at or engage in the work around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, and I really love that. It sounds like, in a sense, the difference between just have, like you said, checking things off in a box. It's like a difference between a skill over against something of value or a virtue that you develop inside of your own heart. Does that make sense? Let's think of it that way, that we're really working on our hearts.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I would agree with that. That yes, competency is more. I think of it as more transactional Like I do this and it gets, it gets the right result. Whereas humility is realizing you will never, you'll make mistakes, and having that right posture where you realize, okay, I made a mistake. I want to get better. Let me be reflective in this process. So the next time this happens, I can maybe change the way I approach a particular scenario or engage in a particular conversation. So the way I talk about it in the course that you'll see in the show notes is that having the right posture, and it's not about seeking to convince, it's about seeking to understand. And a lot of times when we engage in diversity, wherever you fall along that spectrum of inclusion work, that a lot of times the way we've been trained is to try to convince the other person on the other end of the conversation about why I'm right and they're wrong. And having an approach of cultural humility is being able to engage in a conversation, knowing that you may not be able to agree at the end, but that maybe you're walking away as a better person, having had the conversation, so you have a better understanding of where that other person is coming from, as opposed to just hitting your talking points and then nothing happens. There's no movement and there's no real conversation. It becomes more of a, here are my points, let's argue about this. And it's not about arguing, it's about really trying to sit in that ambiguity, or sit in the that space of being uncomfortable. And so I also talk about it is you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable when it comes to developing and holding a posture of cultural humility.
Yeah, talk a little bit. I know you grew up in the church and you're a person of faith. How does your Christian faith impact your work within the diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what's maybe what's the extra little seasoning that your faith provides to the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, I think for me, it's about trying to model my life after Christ, and Christ asked a lot of questions, didn't necessarily give answers, but asked a lot of questions. Someone made the remark that Jesus was a good coach because he asked good questions. And so I try to model the way I coach, the way I approach work around diversity, equity, inclusion with that posture. I have ideas of how people can get better, or how I think we can improve a situation or an organization get better if they are really engaged in this work. And I also talk about, in another course I'll be launching soon, a particular model on how organizations can think about approaching this work of diversity, equity, inclusion. But to answer your question, Brian, it really comes down to trying to model my life after Christ, and knowing that his posture with the woman at the well was one of, I think, just wanting to seek to understand, even though he probably wanted, maybe, his natural reaction would have been to try to convince her she's wrong. But he did that by asking questions, right? By showing her, pointing her towards a window so she can see herself, or a mirror so she can see herself in that mirror. And that's been my approach in doing this work. And so I take a much more less confrontational approach. When it comes to cultural humility, the way I talk about it too is that I'm not telling people that they have to compromise their values or their faith in doing this work. What I am saying is, what if we had a posture of learning where we're seeking to understand, again, going back to what I said earlier, or seeking, as opposed to seeking to convince. And so for me, it centers around who Christ was, who I think he was, who I think the Bible says he was, and really approaching the work of trying to help organizations and people get better at diversity, equity, inclusion by holding that posture.
What are some of your thoughts? You've probably seen some of the same polls that come out that show that oftentimes people of faith actually struggle with issues of race, which seems ironic, and it's clearly problematic. But what is your sense of that, and what's a couple of easy steps if a church wants to open itself up to the diverse world that we live in? What are some of the obvious, maybe, or maybe not obvious, are the blind spots that hinder that work even getting started from your experience?
Oh, that's a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot. We could solve all
I,
the world's problems right now with a lot of
yeah,
stuff.
I think recently what I've been really reflecting on is that people are created in the image of God, all people. And that if they are in God's image, then I think that should compel me and others to really try to understand where people are coming from, their identities, whether that's from the LGBTQ community, Black, Latino, people with seen or unseen disabilities, that people are made in the image of God, and God does not make mistakes.
Mm.
And so I think if we have that posture and that approach, then I think we can get over some of the things around how we've been trained or conditioned to think, socialized to think, that hopefully will move us in the right direction. I think the obstacles generally, I think for me, what I've observed is people have been used to doing things a certain way for a long time. And this work of diversity and equity inclusion is a moving target. There is not because identities continue to change. Our society continues to change. People are changing, right? And so that discombobulates us or throws us a curveball that we don't always know what to do with. And our natural reaction is to want to be closed because we don't understand. This is where the seeking to understand should come in. And that's where I think being comfortable with ambiguity is really important. So the posture is of openness. So can I ask questions so I understand? Tell me more about your identity. Why do you identify as someone who is gender fluid? Because I don't know a lot about that. So I'd like to know more. And again, not to convince them that they're wrong, but just so you can understand. And then maybe you'll learn something, and maybe you will realize that, oh my gosh, this is someone who's made in the image of God. And if I truly believe that, what does that mean for me as a believer, as a person of faith? And how do I treat that person, right? Or how should I treat that person? Same with the immigrant, right? My parents are immigrants. They are made in the image of God. They love God. In their case, they're believers. But even if they weren't believers, if they're made in the image of God, what does that say to us, and what does that compel us to do if we want to get to know people better? So the other thing I talk about in the course is the iceberg theory, right? And so the iceberg theory says that we only see about 10 to 15% above sea level when it comes to an iceberg. But then if you look under the sea level, you see a vast expanse of ice that just, goes wide, right? And it's that stuff that really makes us and shapes us. So values, beliefs, exactly that's exactly
I'm
it.
showing my iceberg picture for those on YouTube to illustrate what Joel's talking about.
Yeah, so that is the values, beliefs, the way I was raised, my political leanings, my journey. And if you're really going to get to know people in a way that I think will help you be better able to serve them, if serving is what you want to do, or just a desire to understand people, is you have to learn how to get to know people below sea level.
That's good.
And so whether that's in someone who's in leadership, someone who is a church leader, someone who's a community leader, we're better able to serve the people in whatever our context if we know them well, instead of just going off of what we see on the cover. And I share the story, and you and I talked about this before we started recording, is that I talk about it in the course, that if you saw me walking down the street and you didn't know me, or if you just were introduced to me, because again, we've been conditioned to think certain ethnic groups look a certain way, you would see me as someone who's white, because I say, when I introduce myself, I'm white presenting, because I'm light skinned. And so people generally don't see me as someone who's not white. An example would be yesterday, we were down the block, we're trying to find our cat who went away. We're trying to find her, but we went to a house. We knocked on the door. We spoke with people, and they led us into their backyard and to look for our cat. And we came out. I started talking to them, and I could tell that they were Spanish speakers, and so they were asking me questions, and then I automatically flipped to start speaking Spanish. Like, oh, you speak Spanish. Um, I didn't know. You didn't look Latino. You didn't look, in my case, I'm Mexican American. So they were, again, going off of what they only saw. But when you get to know me, you would know that I identify as Mexican American and Chicano, that I have 4 children, that my wife is white, and we're raising biracial children, and that faith is very important to me. And that's the importance of really being open, or taking an approach of cultural humility, is to get to know the people, get to know people. I call it other awareness, or not, I don't just call it that, theorists call that. So becoming other aware, and then also self-aware. And so I didn't always feel strongly about my ethnic identity and the way it has shaped me, but through my own identity development, I'm at the place where I'm at now. But again, going back to the original point, is that you wouldn't know I'm Mexican American until you started talking to me and hearing about my story. And so story is so important in doing this work of moving from competency to humility. And cultural competence is, I think, 15 years ago was definitely something we should all have been working on if we were going to get better at doing work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what's happened is that people will feel like they're competent either by attending a conference, reading a book, but it's more than that, because it's not it doesn't end. This work takes, you could use lifelong learning as an example. You just got to continue to learn about this concept of diversity and inclusion, because it will continue to change. I know I said a lot there, so I apologize.
No, I think that was really, really helpful. And, I keep hearing the word curiosity and looking for what's under the iceberg. Talk about if some persons have gone through some training, we try to be sensitive, especially to microaggressions, especially if you're from a dominant culture. And I asked you this before we got on the call too, but a lot of times a person, especially this is often a white person asking somebody else, and I think sometimes it comes out of a place of genuine curiosity, though it can come off as a microaggression. And I've come to, it's just, you meet someone, your brain clicks, this person probably didn't grow up here, and we're making a judgment based on our mind exactly about how the person presents, and you just ask, where are you from? Mm-hmm. You had some helpful language, I think, there, because again, that might be a well-meaning question, but it can make a person feel like an other, right? So kind of break that down a little bit, and what's a more culturally humble approach at that sort of an interaction where you want to honor somebody and you're looking for the words.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to say 2 things that I'll start with something that isn't directly answering your question, but it's related. And it's the idea of being good about noticing our intent versus impact. And so we have good intentions generally as people. But then once we say something or ask a question, we realize it's had a bad impact, right? And the right posture there is to apologize, to not get defensive. Yeah, I didn't mean to offend you, Brian. Because that posture then makes people feel defensive, like, while you offended me, and you're not apologizing, you're making it about you, but in reality, it's about me and how I feel. And right now, I feel like you just offended me. So what I'm really looking for is you to apologize to me.
And not to say I'm sorry I offended you, but I'm sorry I did it.
Sorry I offended you.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to talk more about this, or should we just leave it at that? Because sometimes people you can apologize, but then you start getting defensive, right? Oh, I apologize, I didn't mean that. No, that's not what I meant. This is what I meant. And it might just be better to say, hey, I am really sorry that I offended you. Be happy to talk more about that, or would you rather that I just leave you alone? And someone will say, actually, let's talk about it. And I'll tell you why you offended me and why that was offensive, whatever the aggression, microaggression might have been. So going back to your question about where are you from, maybe the better way to context is like, hey, hey, Brian, let me share a little bit about kind of my background. And I'd love to hear about your background after I share about, me. And it doesn't need to be a long, deep conversation. But you could say, hey, I grew up, like for me, I grew up in Los Angeles and my parents are immigrants and Spanish was my first language. Can you share a little bit about yourself and let the person share what they're comfortable sharing? Again, you're building a connection instead of starting it off with just asking them a question, starting with you to let them know that you're open about sharing who you are. But another way to phrase that question could be, where did you grow up? Tell me a little bit about where you grew up. Because I'd like to know more. Might be a better way as opposed to like just where did you grow up or where are you from? Hey, I noticed that you're wearing, that necklace around your neck. Can you tell me more about, what is there anything significant? Oh, your name's Brian. Hey, can you tell me maybe, do you know why your parents named you Brian? Or Russell's your last name. Can you tell me a little bit about your last name and kind of where that comes from? So things around that, instead of just getting really directive, is a better way, or I would say, and it's not a perfect way, because like I say, I think in the course too, is that we're all going to make mistakes. It goes back to that intent versus impact. So when I present to groups and I'm doing workshops, I will say, I've been doing the work of diversity, equity, inclusion for about 30 years now. I still will say things that are offensive. And I have given myself grace to know that I'm going to make mistakes. But when I make a mistake, it's my approach, again, intent versus impact. And it starts with an apology. And then let's go from there. And knowing that, again, there's not an end point to this work. It continues to change, but it's having the right posture. So that is the better approach. Whereas I think as cultural, like I've said earlier, cultural competency alludes that you've achieved something. And you may have a good foundation, but recognizing that it's a foundation and there's still more work to do. And that's where self-awareness is so important, because as we know, if we become more self-aware, we recognize where our gaps are. And then if we want to get better at this work or any other work, it's about how do we close those gaps so we're more effective at whatever it is that we're trying to do as a leader, as a community member, as a parent.
Do you have any favorite stories of where you've actually seen literally walls come down in more openness, and then the results that had either within an organization or a church? You have a couple of favorite stories that really illustrate the kind of the best outcomes of what we're talking about?
Yeah. So in probably about over a year ago now, I worked with an educational organization, and they started doing a lot of work or trying to get better and being really intentional about trying to create a more inclusive organization with a stronger and cultivating a stronger sense of belonging for all of their students and their employees. And so when I started this work using and I talk about this course, is the use of the intercultural development inventory as a self-awareness tool and an organizational awareness tool, people then recognize, okay, there's a baseline. So I didn't score as high as I would have liked. But then we talk about, okay, again, it's developmental. So the example there is that people started to recognize, okay, I got some work to do. Like I now recognize that I have work to do, but I want to get better and I need help. So help me, Joel. Joel, help me kind of think through, what does that look like? And that started breaking down some walls, because the intercultural development inventory defines culture broadly. So it's not just about race and ethnicity. It's also about gender, socioeconomic status, geography, gender identity, sexual identity, and so it's a tool to help you recognize how you bridge across difference. And when I present it that way, because generally people just feel like it's always just about race and ethnicity. That is important and work needs to be done there, but you got to also think about it in a broader context, and that you can learn and apply these concepts to various ways you bridge across any difference. And so doing this work with this particular organization, it started breaking down some of the walls with a lot of the people, because then they recognize, okay, I can see how I do this a lot. One of the stages is called minimization, where an individual is minimizing difference and not wanting to argue. So they're always like, okay, I want to get from point A to point B in the quickest way. I'm just going to agree to everything. And when you do that, you lose out on opportunities to really engage in meaningful conversation. So when people start recognizing that and noticing it, then they realize, okay, actually, you know what? I need to sit in this space of being uncomfortable and ask some questions so I can understand what's happening, and I can be better at leading, in this case, being a leader or being a teacher. And so that's an example that I share. Personal examples is just when I'm coaching people individually and they're like, yeah, that makes total sense to me, and I can see how that's playing out in my life, and I want to do this differently. So let's talk about, what does that look like, Joel? So help me understand what needs to change in order to make that happen.
Yeah, and I know, well, we've known each other for maybe 3 years now, I guess, something like that.
Almost 4 years, I think.
You know, and you and I, we're both coaching. We've talked probably once a month for maybe not the whole 3 years, but probably the last 2 years, I would guess, right? So we've had a lot of conversations. I was just going to say, just to illustrate what Joel's talking about, Joel's actually helped me a lot. We've talked through some issues on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I think we've tried to model really good conversation and curiosity and learning. And so I just appreciated everything that you're actually saying. Just resonates from the relationship that we've had in our own friendship, and I really like that about you, how you bring these together. Let me give a case, possible little case study. And I did mention this before we got on, so this won't catch you completely off guard. But I'm thinking about, got multiple pastor friends and folks that work in my deep dive program, and they're essentially Anglo congregations, almost 100%. Again, demographic has changed where the church building is, which is sort of a slow death, unless you're literally going to either move to where the people actually live to go to your church, or you shift the ministry. My friends are attempting to make the shift to be more missional and inclusive and outreach. And I can imagine the same sort of thing that happened to me is happening to some of the pastors that I know. Again, I live in a heavily Spanish speaking area, so what I experienced isn't unique. But it's since I'm here, I just went to Publix, the local supermarket, couple months ago, and I had the wonderful experience of a man right outside wanted to talk to me, and he wanted to tell me about Jesus and evangelize me. But the fun thing about this was he essentially spoke Spanish with very, very little English ability. Myself, I know a few theological words and can make a little small talk in Spanish. So our evangelistic conversation didn't get too far, other than I basically was just like, I knew enough to say El Señor es Dios, or so I kind of let him know as a Christian. I remember him smiling, but it wasn't really awkward. It was just more like, he did the best he could. I did the best I could. If you were sitting there kind of watching, and I had a chance to talk to you later, or maybe even a chance to talk to both of us, what's what does cultural humility or even cultural competence look like in a context where the language is a real barrier?
Yeah, well, first I want to affirm what you did, right? Because you stopped and acknowledged his presence, right? Instead of just walking by him. I think a lot of times, and I'm guilty of this too, right? We're really, we're really in a hurry and we don't acknowledge people around us. And so people sometimes don't feel seen. You stopped and talked to him. So my guess is, based on what I know about people, is that he probably appreciated just someone talking to him, and especially someone who maybe doesn't identify or connect with him culturally. So one, I want to affirm that because I think that is the right approach. And so for churches doing this work, or being maybe in a predominantly non-dominant culture area or non-white area, is being able to engage or at least connect with people. Language is a barrier, so I would say learning some words would be helpful to have, at least, whether it's not a very deep conversation, but a conversation is going to be really important. I think asking people, hey, let's go break bread, right? Let's have a meal. And that's where it starts. So you want to build that relationship. So the competency piece is you want to develop some cross-cultural skills. So that may involve language. That may involve, asking them which country, they're from. So then you can learn a little bit about their country. So you have some familiarity if they're from, Cuba or Argentina, wherever the demographic is, or even in our own country, right? Puerto Rico is, even though they're not a state, they're still part of our country. But getting to know a little bit more about the culture will help you identify some things that you may have in common, right? To start that conversation, and then reading about some generalizations about that particular country or cultural group, so that you can engage in a conversation and building a relationship. But the language barrier is always going to be there and present. So finding people that can help you and others, or help the person bridge that difference from in regards to the language barrier. So interpreters, translators, so that you're able to sit and break bread and have a conversation. May have to have someone interpret for you, but that's going to go a long way in helping you start building a relationship with the community that you're trying to build relationships with. And just being, like I said, just being present and letting them know that you're there and that you are open to conversation and to help. Inviting them into your house and getting to know them, and that may lead them inviting you to their house. And that's how it starts. So it's not an easy plop your church or open your doors and put a sign that says se habla español or se habla whatever, is not necessarily going to entice people to come into your church. It's actually going out and doing, building relationships is going to be key.
Good, Joel. Thank you. Yeah, as to honor your time here, I just want to give a chance now. Let's talk a little bit about some of the services that you offer through your coaching program at Apoyo Coaching. Talk about
fine. That was good, Brian.
Good. I know I'm making a face because I always mispronounce words and stuff. So I've been trying to practice. So thank you, Joel, for your patience with me too. So.
Yeah. So I'd welcome people. It'll be in the show notes, a link to my courses if you wanted to take a look at, the course I'm moving from cultural competency to cultural humility. So there's that. The other way is I'm fairly active on LinkedIn, and you can find me there and reach out to me there. Apoyocoaching.com. So Apoyo stands for support for in Spanish. So the way I talk about the way I coach is I listen, bring clarity, and provide support. Apoyo Coaching and Consulting. My website is apoyocoaching.com. That'll be in the show notes as well. And I do coach individuals who want to create space to develop their cultural humility, if that's what they do. And so I call it cultural humility coaching. And we start with developing self-awareness about where they're at on that, intercultural development continuum by taking the intercultural development inventory. And that's the launching point into conversation, or the coaching conversations that I have with people. And so then I work with organizations to help them think through how to move from performative statements to sustainable change in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And you could also work with groups of pastors, like a lot of United Methodists are listening, or some of them will be Global Methodists, but there'll be districts. And so you could potentially be a presenter,
Yes.
like a district meeting or something like that, and do the, and what's the assessment called? I should know that, but I didn't.
It's the Intercultural Development Inventory.
Okay.
You can put the website on the show notes too. It's idiinventory.com. And that'll give you their website, and you can take a look at all, the benefits, the research behind it, all those things. And if you take the course, I unpack it more for people so they can see what that continuum looks like, and then what the IDI is telling you after you take it, and what the orientations are and what they mean.
Yeah, you have a full sample there inside the course that you can take a look at, like what somebody's assessment would look like, and you could use that to coach.
Yep.
Yeah, and how about a couple of like resources that you recommend if persons want to just get started with a book or something? What would be some places?
Yeah. So the book I recommend is Culturally Intelligent Leadership by May Mua. And first name is M-A-I, last name is Mua, and it's M-O-U-A. I'm just going to confirm that right now. I'm looking at it. Where are you? Yeah, M-O-U-A, and it's Culturally Intelligent Leadership.
Great.
Yeah.
Right. Is there anything else that you want to add, Joel? I really appreciate your time and your expertise and your friendship.
No, I did. Again, thank you for having me on your show again, and always a pleasure talking with you. And hopefully people will reach out, and I'd love to connect, and hopefully people will take the course. It retails for $99, so it's not super expensive, and it takes about 18 minutes to complete. So it's not very expensive. And I'll drop a coupon code in the show notes too. It'll knock 50% off the cost if you'd like to take it.
Okay, well, thank you for your generosity. Joel and I have taken the course, and it is helpful. It's quick, but Joel packs a lot of really good content in this, and this could be a good thing. And is it possible if like a pastor buys this, they're allowed to like show it to a group, or do you have any rules on how many people?
Yeah,
can watch
I'd rather you, if you're gonna share it, that you give another person a code so they can see it themselves, as opposed to just watching it as a group.
Okay. And I guess if people are interested in using it for a bigger group, they should reach out to you directly to talk about what that would look like. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you, Joel. Again, thanks you everyone for listening all the way to the end of this week's conversation. And until next time, show up, pay attention, and know that God's got way more invested in your life and in your mission than even you do.